The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, I agree with one thing at least that the member who has resumed his seat said. This parliament needs to take security agencies seriously, if only the government would do so. We have seen a debacle, a farce surrounding the Kim.com affair. The Prime Minister that can't even remember whether he was briefed on Kim.com. Didn't know Kim.com, didn't know about the guy, the biggest guy in his electorate that had the largest mansion in his electorate. He'd never heard of him, never been briefed by the GCSB, but he had been. And the appointment process of the Director-General. You know, the Prime Minister who thinks he can ring up a mate, say, how would you like this job, and there won't be any competition, you'll be the only interviewee, and think he can get away with it, and think that he can get away with not telling this House the full truth. Never admitted that he had breakfast with him on a number of occasions. Never admitted that he was a good mate of his, and went about it in a way that the State Services Commissioner himself said was flawed. He used yes minister language, but what he was really saying is that the Prime Minister broke the protocols, did it wrong. If anybody has undermined the confidence of New Zealanders in our security agencies, it's John Key, who is meant to be the minister responsible for the security agencies, meant to exercise the oversight, but time and again failed to do so. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm one in this House that believes that the security agencies do need reform. They need reform in regard to their powers, that they are 21st century powers, they are appropriate to the work they need to do, but just as importantly, need reform around the oversight of how these agencies that act in secret, act outside the public oversight, can be checked, can be made sure that they are acting under the law and that they are acting properly. And to do that, you need proper legislation. We also need legislation moved through this House in a way that would restore public confidence in the security agencies. TV3 ran a poll the other day. What did it show? A massive 40% of New Zealanders have no confidence, do not trust the GCSB. You cannot operate in a democracy with security agencies that so lack the confidence of the public whose needs they are meant to be serving. That is an indictment on the GCSB. It's an indictment on how the government has handled this matter. And if we do not get this legislation right, and if we do not do it in the right way, build consensus, because you need consensus across the House on how these agencies should be run, we will end up with the GCSB damaged in the same way that the SIS was way back in the 1960s. You'll remember the case, Mr Speaker, where the SIS agent left his briefcase on the street in Wellington. It may have had secret documents, but more attention was given to the copy of the penthouse and the cold pie that he had in it. That made the SIS a laughingstock. We cannot afford our security agencies to be a laughingstock, and unless we do this well, the GCSB will be, just as the SIS was, a laughingstock that lacks public confidence. So what I'm saying to you, Mr Speaker, is that if we're going to do this well, you don't do it in an ad hoc way, you do it comprehensively, and we know that this House is expecting another piece of legislation that the government has tucked away in the wings on the SIS, so a separate piece of legislation on the SIS. This legislation rushed in the House under urgency today on the GCSB. Who is going to have confidence in the outcome of legislation that is done in an ad hoc way? Who is going to have confidence in legislation unless there is a full and public inquiry into how our agencies are operating, what powers they need, and what safeguards there need to be? Now, better than most people in this House, I have an understanding of how our security agencies work. As a Foreign Minister, as a Defence Minister, I worked with those agencies for 9 years. But I think the time has come to fully, comprehensively and coherently reform those agencies. I don't think they do the job that we need them to do. I don't think they do it thoroughly and competently enough, and I don't think that the powers of oversight over how they carry out their functions are done properly. Mr. Speaker, the reason that we've got this legislation is not because there are terrorist groups lurking in the wings. You can never rule out that you don't have nutcases like the Boston bombers that can operate in a country, but that is not, I think, something that is actually such a risk to New Zealand that we need to rush legislation through in an ad hoc way. I think there are more important questions to ask about cybersecurity, about commercial interests and state interests outside of New Zealand that would like to break into our IT networks and use that information. And maybe the government should be asking itself some questions about why, unlike Australia and the United States, it has accepted Huawei into New Zealand when that in itself is regarded by two of the countries we work closely with as being a security risk. The government won't talk about that, but that might be actually what they need to be focusing on. You know, we have this legislation to distract the public from the embarrassment that John Key feels about the debacle of the Kim.com affair. The police that went into that mansion with a combination of Rambo and the Keystone Cops, total overkill, unnecessary. That was bad enough, Mr. Speaker. What was worse, according to Justice Winkelman, is that they went in without a valid warrant to search the place or to break into the place. And that makes us as New Zealanders and as taxpayers liable possibly to hundreds or tens of millions of dollars in damages if that's the way it goes. So we certainly need an inquiry into the Kim.com case. We need to know why, when they acted illegally, and why the advice of Crown Law was inadequate, why Justice didn't get it right, why the police didn't get it right, why the GCSB didn't get it right. We need to know then why Bill English suppressed information that revealed those facts. Why did he cover it up? And is it credible, Mr. Speaker, that John Key, who was the Minister in charge of the security agencies and the Prime Minister, was never told about a once-in-a-lifetime warrant to suppress public information about the government's illegal doings? He didn't brief John Key.
Who believes that?
Who believes that? I mean, either you've got a totally incompetent and disloyal deputy, or you've got a Prime Minister that's not telling the full truth. And I'll leave it to the public to make up their mind on that. Mr. Speaker, we need a proper job to determine the powers and the oversight of the GCSB. This bill doesn't do it, and it acts in a way that there will be no restoration of public confidence in those agencies. I want to look very quickly now, in my last minute and a half, at the oversight proposals in this bill. Rebecca Kitteridge, who's a very competent woman, I think got the direction right, but she didn't go far enough and this bill doesn't go far enough. You need an Inspector General of Security and Intelligence who is not in a retirement position. You need an active Inspector General. More than that, you need a proactive Inspector General. And you need that person to be backed by staffing and resources so that they can ensure compliance. We need to have a strong Inspector General. And that person, if they're not to be a retired judge, needs to have the confidence of both sides of this House. So in this bill there should be legislative provision that the appointment needs the concurrence of the opposition, just as you do for the Governor-General, because that's how important the position is. You also need, Mr. Speaker, changes to be made into the Intelligence and Security Committee. I served on that for 3 years. It's a farce. It doesn't do the job because John Key doesn't let it do the job. It hardly ever meets, it doesn't get briefed properly, and it doesn't give anywhere near adequate reports to this House. It is an absolute conflict of interest that the Minister in charge of the Security Intelligence Service should be the chair of the committee having oversight into the Security Intelligence Committee. He is the person that should be held to account. This bill says, oh, put the Deputy Prime Minister in or the Attorney General. That's not good enough. Maybe we should look at the Regs Review Committee and, like that, have an opposition member chairing that committee, Mr. Speaker.
I call Todd McLean.
Mr. Speaker, what an angry speech from an angry man. Mr. Goff is a man who comes to this